Arthur Pendleton dropped his beautiful wife, Evelyn, off at Logan Airport for a supposed real estate conference, watching her strut through the automatic doors after kissing his cheek with cold precision. He put the truck in drive, believing she was the love of his life, only to find his 9-year-old grandson, Mason, curled up in the back seat, trembling with raw terror. As Arthur merged onto the Mass Pike, Mason grabbed his shoulder with desperate strength and begged him not to drive home. Tears streamed down the boy's face as he confessed the horrifying truth he had overheard over the roar of the morning shower. Evelyn had been on the phone, coldly stating that tonight was the last night for the old man because the medicine had finally soaked in enough to stop his heart. Arthur pulled over to the shoulder, his own heart pounding as he instinctively touched his chest, suddenly connecting his recent dizzy spells to the daily vitamins and nightly chamomile tea Evelyn insisted he drink. His blood turned to ice when Mason revealed she was talking to Dee, telling him to bring a gun just in case the poison failed. There was only one Dee in their lives. Derek, Arthur's son-in-law, the man he had just loaned $50,000 to save a failing tech business. Refusing to involve the police until he saw it with his own eyes, Arthur drove back to Beacon Hill and parked in a dark alley across from his townhouse. He ordered Mason to hide under a blanket just as his phone buzzed with a sickeningly casual text from Evelyn, claiming she had landed safely. Minutes later, a black SUV pulled up to his curb, and Evelyn stepped out wearing the exact same dress, carrying absolutely no luggage. Derek emerged from the driver's seat, striding right up to Evelyn on the cobblestone sidewalk to share a hungry, possessive kiss under the street lamp. Arthur's old military instincts flared, his hand wrapping around the cold steel of a heavy wrench hidden beneath his seat as he prepared to rush the house and end them both. But the sight of his terrified grandson in the rearview mirror stopped him dead. If the poison slowed his reflexes and Derek shot him, Mason would be left alone with two murderers. Swallowing a rage that burned like hellfire, Arthur put the truck in drive and silently rolled away into the Boston night to plan a war. The engine of the rusted truck hummed a low, steady rhythm as Arthur navigated the icy, winding streets away from Beacon Hill. The cobblestones faded into smooth asphalt, but the violent trembling in Arthur's hands remained. It took every ounce of discipline he had forged during his years in the Marines to keep the vehicle steady. He glanced at the rearview mirror again. Mason was still huddled beneath the scratchy wool blanket, his small chest heaving with silent, terrified sobs. The boy had just watched his grandmother kiss his abusive father, cementing a conspiracy to murder the only man who truly protected him. Arthur's jaw tightened until the muscles ached. He wanted to turn the wheel. He wanted to drive the heavy grill of his truck straight through the bay window of his own home and crush the traitors where they stood. The betrayal was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in his chest that rivaled the toxic tea Evelyn had been feeding him. He had built Pendleton Builders from a single cement mixer into a multi-million-dollar empire. He had fought union bosses, survived brutal winters, and outsmarted cutthroat developers. Yet, the deadliest snakes had been sleeping under his own roof, drinking his wine, and spending his hard-earned wealth. He forced himself to inhale the freezing air seeping through the cracked window. Panic and impulse were the enemies of survival. If he called the police now, what did he really have? A child's overheard conversation and a photograph of a kiss. Evelyn was a master manipulator. She would cry, play the victim, and claim Derek had forced himself on her. She would hire expensive lawyers with Arthur's own money and twist the narrative until Arthur looked like a paranoid, senile old fool. And Derek, the arrogant tech failure, would slither away to try again. No, the justice system was too slow, too fragile, and too easily manipulated by wealth. Arthur needed something undeniable. He needed to trap them in their own greed. He needed them to believe they had won, to drop their guard, and to reveal the true depth of their depravity to the world. He reached back and placed a heavy, calloused hand on Mason's shaking knee. The boy jumped, then peeked out from under the blanket, his eyes wide and wet in the glow of the passing streetlights. "You did good, son." Arthur's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, surprisingly steady despite the poison coursing through his veins. "You saved my life tonight. But I need you to be brave a little longer. We are going to a safe place, somewhere they can never find us. And then, we are going to make them pay for what they tried to do to this family." Mason nodded slowly, wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve. The terror in the boy's eyes began to shift, replaced by a tiny, fragile spark of trust. Arthur squeezed the boy's knee once more before turning his attention fully to the road ahead. The poison was a ticking clock. Every dizzy spell, every flutter in his chest was a reminder that Evelyn's nightly tea was actively shutting down his organs. He needed medical attention immediately, but going to a public emergency room would leave a digital trail. Evelyn would be notified. The element of surprise would be lost. He needed a sanctuary, a place where money bought absolute discretion and impenetrable security. He steered the truck toward the financial district, the towering skyscrapers looming like glass and steel sentinels against the black sky. He knew exactly where to go. It was a place he hadn't visited in over a decade, a place he reserved for the darkest of days and the most dangerous of enemies. As the truck rumbled over a patch of black ice, Arthur felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The edges of his vision blurred, a terrifying testament to Evelyn's quiet, daily doses of death. He gripped the steering wheel harder, his knuckles turning stark white. He could not die tonight. He refused to let a greedy, shallow woman and a failed, arrogant boy inherit the empire he had built with his own blood and sweat. He would burn it all to the ground first. But before he could become the architect of their destruction, he had to become a ghost. He pressed the accelerator, the engine roaring in defiance against the biting Boston cold, driving them deeper into the shadows of the city. Arthur pulled his rusted truck up to the valet stand of the Sterling Hotel, a towering fortress of glass and limestone that catered exclusively to Boston's elite and those demanding absolute discretion. The young valet, shivering in his crisp wool uniform, eyed the grease-stained vehicle with thinly veiled disdain, stepping forward to wave the apparent lost driver away from the grand entrance. Arthur did not utter a single word, simply reaching into his worn leather wallet to extract a thick piece of solid black titanium. It was an invite-only membership card devoid of numbers, bearing only a small gold chip and his signature, a relic of his financial power that he had not touched in 15 years. The valet's arrogant sneer vanished the instant he recognized the card, his posture snapping into a terrified bow as he hurriedly opened the heavy truck door. Arthur gathered his exhausted, trembling grandson into his arms, carrying Mason through the opulent lobby where the air smelled of expensive white tea and untouchable wealth. For decades, Arthur had played the role of the humble retired contractor, fixing leaky pipes and driving old trucks because he wanted to be loved for the man he was, not the empire he commanded. But walking across those polished marble floors, he felt the dormant architect waking up, the ruthless businessman who had crushed competitors and built a dynasty from nothing. They rode the private elevator to the penthouse suite in silence, the doors opening to reveal a sprawling expanse of velvet, mahogany, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Boston skyline. Arthur gently laid Mason on the center of the massive king-sized bed, pulling the high thread count sheets over the boy's small frame and assuring him that the hotel's security rivaled a military bunker. Once Mason finally closed his eyes, Arthur retreated to the sprawling marble bathroom, gripping the edges of the sink as a violent wave of nausea threatened to drop him to his knees. He splashed freezing water onto his face and stared at his reflection, noting the unnatural gray pallor of his skin, the bloodshot eyes, and the terrifying tremor in his hands. He knew his body was actively shutting down, the poison working its way through his nervous system exactly as Evelyn had planned, but he refused to let physical weakness dictate the outcome of this war. Reaching into the secret lining of his heavy winter coat, he retrieved an outdated but highly secure satellite phone, dialing a number he had not needed to call since his days in the Marine Corps. The line rang only once before a gruff voice answered, and Arthur bypassed all pleasantries to demand a Protocol 7 medical team at the Sterling penthouse, specifically ordering Dr. Harrison to arrive immediately with a full toxicology kit. Harrison, recognizing the raspy, desperate voice of his oldest friend and former brother-in-arms, dropped his clinical detachment instantly, promising to be there in 20 minutes with everything required to keep Arthur alive. True to his word, Harrison bypassed the grand lobby entirely, utilizing the hotel's discreet service elevator reserved for high-profile guests who preferred to remain unseen by the public eye. The silver-haired doctor carried a heavy black medical case, his jaw tightening into a grim line the moment he laid eyes on Arthur's deteriorating physical condition, requiring no explanation to understand the severity of the situation. Moving with the practiced, silent efficiency of a combat medic under fire, Harrison transformed the penthouse's elegant mahogany dining table into a sterile mobile laboratory within minutes. He strapped a blood pressure cuff to Arthur's arm, attached erratic-sounding heart monitors to his chest, and drew vial after vial of dark red blood, working with a focused intensity that left no room for comforting platitudes. The portable analyzer whirred and clicked in the deafening silence of the suite, processing the samples while Arthur sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, keeping a watchful eye on the bedroom door to ensure Mason remained asleep. He prayed the boy would not wake up and wander out to see his grandfather hooked up to a terrifying array of tubes and wires, looking like a man standing on the very precipice of death. When the machine finally beeped with a sharp, piercing sound, Harrison ripped the printed results from the slot, his normally stoic face turning pale as he read the chemical breakdown of Arthur's blood. "Thallium," Harrison announced, his voice low and heavy with the weight of a judge passing a death sentence, confirming that Arthur had been subjected to chronic, high-level exposure over a period of several months. The doctor explained that it was a tasteless, odorless heavy metal, administered in perfectly calculated low doses designed to mimic the natural onset of heart failure and physical decline in an aging man. Another week of drinking Evelyn's poisoned chamomile tea, Harrison stated grimly, and Arthur's heart would have simply stopped beating in his sleep, leaving no immediate suspicion of foul play for a standard coroner to investigate. The reality of the betrayal hit Arthur harder than the chemical itself, visualizing his wife sitting on the arm of his chair every night, smiling sweetly and running her fingers through his hair while feeding him liquid death. Harrison immediately began packing his equipment, insisting that they needed to transport Arthur to Massachusetts General Hospital right away for aggressive dialysis and monitored chelation therapy to pull the heavy metal from his organs. Arthur slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, his voice commanding and absolute as he explicitly refused hospitalization, knowing that a hospital admission would generate a digital record that Evelyn would inevitably discover. He explained that if he went to the authorities or a public hospital now, Evelyn and Derek would know they had failed, giving them the opportunity to destroy evidence, hide the assets, and flee the state before the trap could snap shut. He demanded that Harrison treat him right there in the penthouse with pills and injections, declaring that he needed the traitors to believe they had won, because playing dead was the only way to lure the monsters completely out into the open. The heavy, rhythmic dripping of the intravenous fluid was the only sound in the dim penthouse as Dr. Harrison worked to flush the toxic thallium from Arthur's bloodstream. The medication brought a chilling clarity to Arthur's mind, extinguishing the immediate physical panic and leaving behind a vast, cold expanse of calculated rage. As the tremors in his hands finally began to subside, he reached back into his coat pocket and withdrew the encrypted satellite phone, dialing a second number reserved solely for the shadows of Boston's elite. The line connected to Silas, a high-end underworld operative and private investigator who made a very lucrative living making severe problems disappear for the city's most powerful figures. Arthur did not offer pleasantries, merely providing the address of his Beacon Hill estate and demanding absolute, microscopic surveillance of the entire property within the hour. Silas, recognizing the dangerous, gravelly timbre of the builder's voice, did not ask questions about warrants or legalities, simply quoting a staggering price that Arthur accepted without a second thought. Arthur commanded him to treat the townhouse as hostile territory, instructing the fixer to wire every single room with cameras and microphones so perfectly hidden that not even a seasoned paranoid could find them. Within 2 hours, the silent machinery of Silas's network descended upon the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill with terrifying efficiency. Knowing the exact layout and the specific blind spots of the high-end security system he had installed himself, Arthur guided the operatives remotely, allowing them to bypass the perimeter alarms while Evelyn and Derek were briefly distracted elsewhere in the house. The infiltration team moved like phantoms, slipping microscopic lenses into the smoke detectors, weaving fiber optic microphones through the ornate crown molding, and tapping directly into the home's central internet router. They turned the grand, historic townhouse into a digital fishbowl, capturing every angle, every whisper, and every shadow cast against the mahogany walls. By the time the operatives vanished back into the freezing Boston night, leaving no trace of their presence behind, the trap was fully armed and waiting for the prey to step into the light. Back at the Sterling Hotel, Silas himself arrived through the discreet service elevator, bypassing the front desk to hand-deliver a heavy, military-grade tablet directly to Arthur's bedside. Silas gave a brief, grim nod of respect before stepping out, leaving Arthur alone in the quiet suite with the sleeping boy and the glowing screen that held the key to his vengeance. Arthur sat propped up against the plush pillows of the king-sized bed, the intravenous line still taped securely to his bruised forearm, and tapped the encrypted application on the tablet's screen. The high-definition feed flickered to life, dividing the display into a dozen different angles of his own home, bathing the darkened hotel room in a pale, sterile glow. He expanded the view of his private ground-floor study, a sanctuary of leather armchairs, rare books, and the heavy oak desk where he had spent decades drawing the blueprints of his empire. A moment later, the heavy oak doors swung open, and Evelyn strode into the room, followed closely by Derek, both of them flushed with an arrogant, manic energy that turned Arthur's stomach. Derek walked straight past the antique globe, bypassing the cheap liquor to retrieve Arthur's most prized bottle of 50-year-old vintage scotch, pouring 2 generous, careless glasses. He handed one to Evelyn, and they raised their crystal tumblers in a mocking toast to the empty room, celebrating the impending death of the man whose home they were actively defiling. The crisp, amplified sound of the crystal clinking echoed through the tablet speakers, a sharp, auditory dagger that drove the reality of their betrayal even deeper into Arthur's chest. Evelyn kicked off her designer heels and immediately began tearing the pristine study apart, shedding the refined, elegant persona she wore for Boston high society to reveal the feral, greedy creature lurking underneath. She swept rare first editions off the shelves, letting them crash to the hardwood floor, and hurled velvet cushions aside as she systematically hunted for the hidden wall sakes she knew existed but had never been permitted to access. She moved with a frantic, desperate violence, complaining loudly to Derek about how the stubborn old man had hoarded his wealth, her voice dripping with a venomous entitlement that made Arthur clench his jaw until his teeth ached. Derek watched her tear through the room with a lazy, satisfied smirk plastered across his face, taking slow sips of the stolen scotch as he leaned casually against the marble fireplace mantel. Then, Derek set his glass down on the polished stone and reached into the back waistband of his tailored trousers, drawing out a sleek, black 9mm pistol. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as the younger man expertly checked the chamber, the metallic clack of the slide echoing ominously over the hidden microphones, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was not merely a passive poisoning. Derek playfully aimed the barrel of the heavy weapon at the ceiling, tracing an invisible target before leveling the gun toward the doorway, pantomiming 2 quick, silent shots at an imaginary figure walking through the hall. The sheer audacity of the weapon solidified the ice flowing through Arthur's veins, confirming the horrifying truth that Derek and Evelyn were a fully prepared execution squad operating right inside his sanctuary. If the daily doses of thallium had somehow failed to stop his heart, if Arthur had managed to stumble home from the airport and survive the night, Derek was fully prepared to put a bullet in his chest and stage a tragic, fatal robbery. They were not just waiting for him to die, they were actively hunting him, utterly confident that their wealth and connections would shield them from many legal consequences. Arthur watched Evelyn finally discover the outline of the safe hidden behind a framed oil portrait of his daughter, Sarah, listening to her shriek with delight as she demanded Derek bring his heavy tools to crack the steel door. They truly believed they had conquered the mountain, standing triumphantly atop the spoils of a dead man's labor, entirely unaware that the dead man was watching their every move. Arthur slowly lowered the tablet, resting it on his lap as he looked over at his grandson, vowing to the silent room that he would engineer a collapse so absolute that the traitors would be buried beneath the rubble of their own greed. Arthur's encrypted phone buzzed on the nightstand just as the morning sun began to bleed over the Boston skyline, piercing the heavy blackout curtains of the penthouse. The caller ID displayed his daughter's name, Sarah, a sight that caused a fresh wave of protective fury to wash over him as he muted the live feed of his ransacked study. He answered with a carefully cultivated rasp, playing the role of the weakening old man they all expected him to be, and was immediately met with the sound of desperate, ragged sobbing. Sarah explained in a rushed, terrified whisper that Derek had called her from a supposed emergency investor meeting in New York, claiming his tech startup had catastrophically collapsed overnight. He had told her that ruthless private equity backers were demanding $50,000 by noon or they would seize their home and ruin them both, a lie so staggering in its audacity that Arthur had to close his eyes to suppress a dark, humorless laugh. Derek was not in New York negotiating with venture capitalists. Derek was barely 3 miles away in Beacon Hill, currently sleeping off a hangover in Arthur's own bed next to Arthur's treacherous wife. Suppressing his disgust at the sheer laziness of the young man's alibi, Arthur instructed Sarah to come to the Sterling Hotel immediately, telling her to meet him in the private mahogany panel business center on the mezzanine level. When Sarah arrived 40 minutes later, Arthur felt a sharp, physical ache in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the heavy metal still lingering in his system. His beloved daughter, the vibrant woman who used to run the logistics floor of Pendleton Builders with a fierce, independent fire, looked like a hollowed-out ghost of her former self. She was frighteningly thin, her eyes heavily shadowed with exhaustion, and her hands trembled uncontrollably as she clutched her worn purse, a stark contrast to the designer luxuries her husband flaunted around Boston. Arthur gestured for her to sit across the heavy conference table, letting his shoulders slump and his breathing hitch as he prepared to deliver the ultimate test of her loyalty. He needed to know beyond a shadow of a doubt whether she was a willing accomplice in the plot to drain his empire, or simply another victim caught in the crossfire of Derek's insatiable greed. Leaning forward with a manufactured wheeze, Arthur softly confessed to his daughter that his heart was finally giving out, falsely claiming that the doctors had given him only a few weeks left to live. He watched her face with the calculated intensity of a hawk, delivering the final blow by stating he planned to sign over complete power of attorney and the entirety of the Pendleton estate to Evelyn, arguing that his wife was best equipped to manage their wealth. If Sarah were part of the conspiracy, she would have nodded along, relieved that the path to the inheritance had been cleared without any legal friction. Instead, Sarah stood up so fast her heavy leather chair tipped backward onto the carpet, her face draining of all color as pure, unadulterated panic completely consumed her. She begged him not to do it, her voice cracking as the dam of her tightly kept secrets finally burst, spilling the horrifying truth about the psychological warfare Derek had waged against her behind closed doors. She wept as she confessed that Derek constantly belittled her, isolated her from her friends, and repeatedly warned her that Evelyn was a dangerous predator who would leave them penniless if Arthur ever died, using fear to control Sarah's every waking move. The revelation was a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation, proving that Derek had deliberately turned his wife against her stepmother simply to keep her off balance while he secretly slept with the very woman he told Sarah to fear. Seeing the absolute, undeniable innocence in his daughter's tear-streaked face, Arthur stood up and walked around the heavy oak table to wrap his arms around her fragile frame, the cold machinery of his revenge solidifying into an unbreakable vow. He promised her that he was not going to die anytime soon, pulling a leather-bound checkbook from his breast pocket to draft the $50,000 Derek had demanded. He handed the crisp slip of paper to Sarah, knowing full well it was not a lifeline for a failing business, but rather a brightly painted lure designed to drag the arrogant fool directly into the abyss. Arthur gave her strict, uncompromising instructions never to sign a single document Derek put in front of her without his explicit approval, sending her out of the hotel with the weapon that would trigger the financial guillotine. As he watched her hurried departure through the glass doors, Arthur mentally prepared to sever the supply lines, perfectly content to let Derek believe he had just drained the old man dry. Arthur sat propped up against the plush pillows of the hotel bed, his body still aching from the residual poison, while his mind remained as sharp and unforgiving as a steel trap. He watched the heavy military tablet provided by Silas, his eyes tracking a pulsating red dot that represented the GPS signal hidden on Derek's luxury vehicle. The dot was moving swiftly through the congested afternoon traffic of Boston, but it was not heading anywhere near the financial district or any corporate office where a desperate businessman might beg for a loan extension. Instead, the vehicle bypassed the commercial zones entirely and wove its way straight toward Newbury Street, the most exclusive and outrageously expensive shopping district in the entire city. Arthur felt a cold, dark satisfaction settling heavily over his chest as the lie unraveled exactly as he had predicted during his meeting with Sarah. Derek and Evelyn were not frantically trying to save a collapsing tech company. They were rushing to spend the spoils of their betrayal before Arthur was even placed in the ground. Silas and his underworld operatives were absolute masters of observation, seamlessly hacking into the closed-circuit security cameras of the high-end retail stores to provide Arthur with a flawless live video feed. Arthur watched intently as Derek and Evelyn strolled into a pristine, brightly lit jewelry boutique that served complimentary champagne to its elite clientele. Evelyn clung tightly to Derek's arm, wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors and acting like a grieving widow who had just suddenly inherited the world. Derek strutted through the marble-floored showroom with his chest puffed out proudly, radiating an unearned, suffocating arrogance that made the blood roar in Arthur's ears. They bypassed the modest displays entirely and walked directly toward the reinforced glass cases housing the most opulent, vulgar pieces in the entire store. Derek pointed a careless finger at a massive diamond solitaire ring, demanding that the white-gloved clerk bring it out immediately for his newly wealthy lover to try on. The brilliant stone carried a staggering price tag of $40,000, a sum that Derek fully intended to pay using the supplementary Black American Express card Arthur had graciously provided him years ago for absolute emergencies. Evelyn held her hand up to the perfect lighting of the boutique, openly admiring the brilliant sparkle of the diamond before leaning in to share a deep, passionate kiss with the man who was actively trying to murder her husband. The sheer audacity of their actions pushed Arthur past the point of quiet anger and into a realm of absolute, icy resolve. He picked up his secure satellite phone and dialed the private, unlisted number for the director of his bank's elite fraud department, a man he had trusted and played poker with for nearly 2 decades. The director answered on the first ring, and Arthur spoke in a flat, unrecognizable tone, identifying himself and issuing the immediate execution of the Phoenix Protocol. He ordered the complete and total freezing of every single account tied to his name, demanding that all associated credit cards be flagged as compromised and stolen effective immediately. The sullen confirmation echoed through the phone speaker just as Derek lazily dropped the heavy black titanium card onto the glass display counter, not even bothering to look at the young clerk as he issued his command to ring up the purchase. Arthur watched the silent video feed with bated breath, his eyes locked on the clerk as she picked up the card and inserted the gold chip into the sleek payment terminal. A harsh red light flashed on her screen, prompting her to frown in confusion and offer a polite apology as she attempted to run the massive transaction a second time. Derek's arrogant smile faltered instantly, replaced by a deep, indignant scowl as he leaned aggressively over the counter, gesturing wildly toward the card and mouthing furious demands about his supposedly infinite credit limit. The clerk visibly shrank back from his sudden hostility, her hands trembling as she quickly pressed a hidden button under the counter to summon the boutique manager from the back office to handle the rapidly escalating situation. The manager was a tall, severe-looking man who stepped onto the showroom floor with an air of absolute, unyielding authority, taking the black card from the frightened clerk and typing the numbers directly into his main terminal. The screen flashed the mandatory confiscation order issued mere seconds ago by the bank's highest fraud division, confirming that the card in his hand was completely null and void. The manager did not offer an apology or a polite excuse, but instead reached into his tailored suit pocket and produced a pair of heavy silver scissors, completely ignoring Derek's immediate shouts of protest. With a swift, practiced motion, the manager snicks the prestigious black card squarely in half, letting the two useless pieces of plastic and metal clatter disrespectfully onto the polished glass counter. Derek lunged forward in a blind rage, slamming his fists violently against the display case, but the boutique's massive security guards were already stepping out of the shadows with their hands resting threateningly on their utility belts. Evelyn's face drained of all color, her carefully constructed facade of wealthy entitlement shattering into a million pieces as the other wealthy patrons in the store stopped browsing to stare and whisper at the unfolding spectacle. She frantically dug through her designer purse to produce her own credit cards, begging the manager to try them, but he merely glanced at the names and coldly shook his head, signaling the guards to intervene and remove the disturbance. The armed security men grabbed Derek by his tailored lapels, effortlessly overpowering his pathetic attempts at resistance and physically marching him toward the heavy glass exit doors. Evelyn followed closely behind, trying desperately to cover her face with her expensive silk scarf to hide her deep, burning shame from the judgmental eyes of Boston's high society. They were tossed out onto the freezing, unforgiving pavement of Newbury Street like common shoplifters, leaving the $40,000 diamond ring behind and realizing with sudden, visceral horror that the well of Arthur's money had run completely dry. The heavy oak doors of the Beacon Hill townhouse flew open with such violent force that the brass handles gouged deep marks into the plaster walls. Derek and Evelyn stumbled into the grand foyer, their previous arrogance completely obliterated by the burning humiliation they had just endured on Newbury Street. Evelyn kicked off her expensive shoes, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she paced the length of the Persian rug, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into her palms. The reality of the frozen black card had finally shattered their delusions of an easy victory, bringing a terrifying truth crashing down upon their heads. The bank manager had not cited a simple technical error or a routine security check. The accounts had been deliberately locked by the primary holder, which meant Arthur Pendleton was not lying dead in a ditch from a sudden heart attack. He was alive, he was aware, and he had actively severed their access to his massive fortune. Derek collapsed onto the leather sofa in the ruined study, his hands buried in his hair as the slick facade of the successful technology investor melted away to reveal a desperate, cornered rat. He looked up at Evelyn with wild, panicked eyes, confessing that the $50,000 he had demanded from Sarah was never meant for corporate backers or failing startup operations. He had borrowed heavily from ruthless underground bookies to fund his lavish lifestyle, and those dangerous men were expecting their payment by the end of the week. He explained with a cracking voice that if he did not deliver the cash, these men would not simply file a lawsuit, they would break his legs and toss him into the Boston Harbor. Evelyn stared at her lover with pure, unadulterated disgust, realizing that the man she had conspired with to commit murder was nothing more than a pathetic liability. But the immediate threat of violence forced them into a frantic alliance, driving them to scour the house for the emergency cash reserves Arthur always kept hidden for sudden contingencies. Arthur lay perfectly still in his luxurious bed at the Sterling Hotel, watching the live tablet feed with a cold, predatory satisfaction as the two traders transformed into feral animals. He watched Derek take a heavy brass fire poker to the custom oak bookshelves, smashing the expensive wood into splinters in a desperate search for a hidden wall safe that did not exist. Evelyn was on her hands and knees in the master bedroom, frantically ripping up the edges of the expensive carpets and tearing the heavy mattress off the bed frame. They were systematically destroying the beautiful home Arthur had built, sweating and swearing at each other as their panic amplified with every empty drawer and hollow wall they discovered. They had no idea that Arthur had already removed the $300,000 in emergency cash weeks ago, moving the bundled bills to a secure deposit box the very morning he first suspected Evelyn was slipping poison into his tea. While the two parasites ransacked the Beacon Hill estate, Silas and his elite team of underworld operatives were busy executing a masterful theatrical diversion miles away on the treacherous, icy cliffs north of the city. Silas had procured a battered Ford pickup truck that was an absolute, flawless replica of Arthur's vehicle, matching every single rust spot, dent, and faded paint line with terrifying precision. His men drove the decoy truck to a notorious stretch of winding coastal highway known for fatal accidents, waiting for the perfect moment when the freezing fog rolled in thick off the Atlantic Ocean. With the steering wheel locked and a heavy cinder block resting on the accelerator, they sent the heavy vehicle plummeting over the steep embankment, watching as it crashed violently against the jagged rocks below. The fuel tank ruptured on impact, sending a magnificent, roaring fireball shooting up into the black winter sky, creating an inferno so intense that identifying the non-existent driver would be a forensic impossibility. Back in the devastated living room of the townhouse, the sharp, shrill ringing of the landline telephone pierced through the sounds of Derek smashing a decorative vase against the fireplace. Evelyn froze, her chest heaving as she stared at the glowing caller identification screen, seeing the official seal of the Massachusetts State Police flashing brightly in the dim light. She took a deep breath, instantly composing her features into a mask of tragic concern, and picked up the receiver with a perfectly executed, trembling voice. The stern state trooper on the other end of the line delivered the grim news, explaining that Arthur's truck had been found completely incinerated at the bottom of a coastal ravine, leaving no chance of survival for anyone trapped inside the cab. Evelyn let out a masterful wail of manufactured grief, sinking to her knees on the hardwood floor and sobbing into the phone, begging the officer to tell her it was all a terrible mistake. She played the role of the devastated, heartbroken widow with absolute perfection, thanking the officer for his time before slowly placing the receiver back onto its cradle. The very second the line disconnected, the fake tears vanished from her eyes, replaced by a dark, euphoric gleam that made her look truly demonic in the shadows of the study. She looked up at Derek, who was still gripping the brass fire poker, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. She whispered that the old man was finally dead, rationalizing that the frozen bank accounts must have been nothing more than an automated fraud alert triggered by Arthur's sudden, fatal accident. The crushing panic in the room evaporated instantly, replaced by a sick, twisted celebration as Derek dropped the poker and pulled Evelyn into his arms, laughing maniacally into the quiet house. They truly believed the nightmare was over, utterly convinced that the vast Pendleton empire was now legally theirs for the taking, completely unaware that the real architect of their destruction was watching their sick celebration through the hidden cameras, preparing to spring the final, devastating phase of his trap. The sterile hum of the machines at Massachusetts General Hospital provided the perfect auditory backdrop for the greatest illusion of Arthur Pendleton's life. Thanks to Silas's extensive underworld connections, Arthur had been smuggled into a highly secured intensive care unit under the direct supervision of Dr. Harrison. Before the sun had even begun to rise, a trusted theatrical makeup artist had spent nearly 2 hours meticulously painting Arthur's face and torso, applying layers of purple and yellow pigments to create horrifyingly realistic bruising. Fake lacerations and carefully placed bandages sold the narrative of a man who had barely survived a catastrophic, fiery plunge down a coastal ravine. Harrison administered a perfectly calculated, mild sedative to drastically slow Arthur's heart rate and shallow his breathing, forcing his body into a state that perfectly mimicked a deep, unresponsive coma. Lying motionless beneath the crisp white hospital sheets, Arthur focused entirely on the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, preparing his mind for the grueling psychological endurance test that was about to walk through the heavy wooden doors. The sudden, chaotic burst of noise from the hallway signaled the arrival of the grieving family, their entrance heralded by Evelyn's shrill, perfectly pitched cries of manufactured despair. She burst into the intensive care unit clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest, her face pale and her eyes wide as she rushed toward the foot of the bed. She wailed Arthur's name, throwing her arms over his motionless legs and sobbing violently for the benefit of the 2 attending nurses who stood sympathetically in the corner. Derek hovered right behind her, playing the role of the strong, supportive son-in-law, resting a comforting hand on Evelyn's shaking shoulder while looking somberly at the blinking heart monitors. To the untrained eye of the medical staff, they were the absolute picture of a devastated family grappling with an unimaginable tragedy, their performance so convincing it practically demanded an Academy Award. But beneath his closed eyelids, Arthur could sense the absolute absence of genuine warmth, feeling only the cold, calculating energy of 2 predators verifying that their prey was finally incapacitated. As soon as Dr. Harrison politely ushered the nurses out into the hallway to afford the family a moment of privacy, the heavy atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The loud, theatrical sobbing ceased the very second the door clicked shut, replaced by a suffocating, deeply cynical silence as Evelyn slowly straightened her posture. She leaned down intimately over Arthur's chest, the sickeningly sweet scent of her expensive floral perfume invading his nostrils and turning his stomach into a knot of pure disgust. Her lips brushed against his bruised ear, but the words she whispered were devoid of any lingering affection, dripping instead with a concentrated, lethal venom that sent a chill down his spine. She told him to stop fighting the machines and just let go, calling him a useless, broken old man who needed to do them all a favor and finally die so she could inherit the wealth she so rightfully deserved. Derek chuckled softly from the foot of the bed, swirling a paper cup of terrible hospital coffee as he casually remarked that the stubborn old bastard was taking entirely too long to expire. It took every ounce of military discipline Arthur possessed to keep his jaw slack and his heart rate steady, swallowing the burning desire to open his eyes and wrap his hands around her treacherous throat. The agonizing charade was suddenly interrupted by the frantic opening of the door, revealing Sarah, who had practically sprinted through the hospital corridors the moment she received the terrible phone call. Unlike Evelyn's carefully choreographed theatrics, Sarah's grief was a raw, visceral force that completely shattered the quiet cruelty of the room. She pushed past Derek without a second glance, falling to her knees beside Arthur's bed and burying her tear-streaked face against his battered hand. Her sobs were deep, ragged, and utterly genuine, the sound of a daughter terrified of losing the only parent who had ever truly protected her from the harsh realities of the world. She pleaded with him to wake up, her hot tears soaking into the hospital blankets and burning Arthur's skin with a profound, suffocating guilt. He wanted nothing more than to squeeze her hand, to open his eyes and assure his beloved little girl that it was all an elaborate stage play designed to save her from the monster standing just a few feet away. But he knew that breaking the illusion now would completely destroy the trap, realizing with a heavy heart that Sarah had to genuinely believe he was gone so Evelyn and Derek would never doubt their impending victory. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside the intensive care unit was broken only by the sharp, rhythmic hiss of the mechanical ventilator when Dr. Harrison finally stepped back into the room. He carried a silver medical clipboard pressed tightly against his chest, wearing the grim, impenetrable expression of a seasoned physician preparing to deliver the most devastating news imaginable. He gently placed a hand on Sarah's shaking shoulder, guiding the weeping woman a few steps away from the hospital bed to allow the rest of the family to gather around the monitors. Evelyn and Derek immediately moved into position, their postures rigid with poorly concealed anticipation, fully expecting the doctor to formally pronounce the time of death and release the massive Pendleton fortune into their eager, blood-stained hands. Instead, Harrison let out a long, heavy sigh, looking directly into Evelyn's eyes as he began to outline a medical prognosis so terrifying it made the air in the room run completely cold. Harrison explained in a steady, measured clinical tone that Arthur had miraculously survived the horrific, fiery impact of the plunge down the coastal ravine, but the brutal trauma to his brain stem had caused catastrophic, irreversible damage. He introduced the medical term locked-in syndrome, speaking slowly to ensure the horrifying reality of the condition fully penetrated the minds of the greedy conspirators standing before him. The doctor detailed that while Arthur's cognitive functions remained perfectly intact, meaning he could hear every spoken word, see every movement, and process every single emotion, his physical body was now an absolute, unyielding prison. He was completely and permanently paralyzed from the neck down, unable to move a single muscle, unable to speak a single syllable, and requiring 24-hour assistance just to sustain his basic biological functions. The devastating revelation hung heavily in the sterile, fluorescent light of the hospital room, prompting Sarah to let out a raw, agonizing wail of pure despair as she collapsed into a nearby vinyl chair, entirely broken by the thought of her fiercely independent father trapped endlessly inside his own mind. Lying perfectly still beneath the crisp white hospital sheets, Arthur cracked his bruised, heavy eyelids just a fraction of a millimeter, allowing him to observe his treacherous wife's immediate reaction through the blur of his eyelashes. There was absolutely no horror etched across Evelyn's perfectly contoured face, no tears welling in her eyes, and not a single ounce of pity for the man she had sworn to love and cherish. Instead, a chilling, calculating light snapped on behind her dark eyes, and a slow, barely perceptible smile began to spread across her lips as the sheer magnitude of her legal advantage washed over her. She exchanged a rapid, loaded glance with Derek, their shared silence communicating volumes as they instantly recognized the brilliant, unexpected loophole this medical tragedy had provided them. A dead Arthur would have required a mandatory state autopsy, a formal reading of his last will and testament, and potential legal hurdles mounted by a grieving, suspicious daughter. But a living, permanently incapacitated Arthur meant that Evelyn, as his current legal spouse, automatically and unquestionably assumed full power of attorney, granting her absolute, unmitigated control over his sprawling bank accounts, his vast properties, and his very life. Slipping flawlessly into her newly appointed role as the fiercely devoted matriarch, Evelyn stepped aggressively toward the hospital bed, taking Arthur's limp, battered hand in hers and digging her manicured nails deeply into his palm with a possessive, territorial cruelty. She looked up at Dr. Harrison with a masterfully crafted mask of tragic determination, her voice trembling with false bravery as she firmly declared that she would never allow her beloved husband to rot away in a cold, unfeeling medical facility. She insisted that she would take full responsibility for his intensive care, demanding that he be transported back to their Beacon Hill estate immediately so he could be surrounded by the familiar comforts of his own home. Derek quickly stepped up right beside her, placing a supportive, heavy hand on her shoulder and loudly praising her saintly devotion, assuring the medical staff that they would manage the estate and protect Arthur's legacy together. They were actively building a prison, fully intending to torture the paralyzed old man and gleefully spend his millions right in front of his helpless, unblinking eyes, completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. Dr. Harrison played his designated part with absolute perfection, issuing stern, grave warnings about the immense, crushing physical burden of managing feeding tubes, catheters, and constant respiratory monitoring without professional nursing staff. Evelyn remained stubbornly steadfast, her manufactured dedication ultimately securing the doctor's reluctant signature on the official medical release forms required to initiate the private ambulance transport. As Harrison turned and exited the room to finalize the complex transfer logistics, Arthur lay motionless in his terrifying physical trap, feeling the cold, hard satisfaction of a seasoned apex predator watching the cage door finally swing shut. Evelyn truly believed she had claimed the ultimate, untouchable victory, strutting around the hospital room with the quiet arrogance of a queen who had just successfully executed a bloody coup. She was entirely, profoundly unaware that she was not taking home a helpless, paralyzed victim, but rather dragging a meticulously armed Trojan horse directly into the very center of a living room that Silas had already wired with a dozen hidden cameras. The private ambulance ride through the icy Boston streets was a blur of flashing lights and the sterile smell of antiseptic, but the true nightmare commenced the moment the paramedics rolled Arthur's heavy medical bed into the grand foyer of his Beacon Hill townhouse. They had completely rearranged his pristine living room, pushing his custom leather armchairs against the mahogany walls and rolling up the expensive Persian rug to create a makeshift hospital ward right in the center of his sanctuary. The paramedics were gentle, tucking the thin white sheets securely around his motionless body and adjusting the intravenous drips before giving Evelyn a final, sympathetic nod of encouragement. Evelyn played the role of the overwhelmed but devoted wife flawlessly, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief and promising the medical technicians that she would monitor his shallow breathing like a hawk. But the very second the heavy oak front door clicked shut and the deadbolt slid heavily into place, the stifling air of tragic mourning evaporated instantly, replaced by a suffocating, predatory silence that signaled the true beginning of his imprisonment. Evelyn dropped the handkerchief to the floor, her manufactured sorrow morphing into an expression of sheer, unadulterated boredom as she walked over to the bay window and violently snapped the heavy velvet curtains shut to block out the prying eyes of the city. The physical torture began almost immediately, characterized not by active violence but by a calculated, profound neglect designed to strip away every last ounce of his humanity. Dr. Harrison had provided meticulous instructions for a highly specialized liquid diet, but Evelyn quickly deemed the blending and preparation far too bothersome, replacing his meals with the cheapest, heavily processed nutrient paste she could acquire. She hooked the thick, gray slurry up to his feeding tube with rough, careless hands, administering just enough sustenance to keep his heart beating so his signature could eventually be perfectly forged on the estate transfer documents. Arthur suffered from an agonizing, perpetual thirst, his mouth transforming into a cracked, bleeding desert while he was forced to listen to the agonizing clink of ice cubes as Evelyn and Derek casually poured themselves tall glasses of expensive scotch just a few feet away. When the inevitable indignity of his bodily functions arose, they stubbornly refused to bathe or change him for hours on end, complaining loudly about the revolting burden he had become in his own home. Instead of providing basic sanitary care, Derek simply purchased a dozen cans of cheap, synthetic lavender air freshener, spraying thick, choking clouds of the toxic perfume directly over Arthur's bed to mask the stench of their own abhorrent neglect. The physical deprivation was agonizing, but it paled in comparison to the relentless psychological warfare they waged to completely erase him while he was still trapped inside the room. Derek sauntered through the townhouse wearing Arthur's expensive silk robes, his bare feet padding arrogantly across the hardwood floors as he openly mocked the motionless titan who had built the very walls sheltering him. He would intentionally stand directly at the foot of the medical bed, sipping Arthur's prized vintage wine and swirling the amber liquid tauntingly, whispering cruel, jagged insults about how the great Boston architect had been reduced to a pathetic, rotting piece of meat. They watched mindless television comedies on his massive flat screen, their sharp, careless laughter echoing off the high ceilings and driving stakes of absolute fury directly into Arthur's racing heart. They spoke about him entirely in the third person, meticulously planning international vacations and massive real estate purchases with his frozen assets, treating him not as a living, breathing human being, but as a broken, obsolete appliance waiting to be dragged out to the curb. The absolute zenith of their cruelty manifested late one evening when Derek deliberately led Evelyn to the plush leather sofa position directly within Arthur's fixed, unblinking line of sight. Arthur's eyelids were stiff and heavy, but the paralysis prevented him from turning his head or shutting out the horrifying spectacle as the two traitors began to strip away their clothes right in front of his medical bed. They made love with a loud, performative vulgarity, actively flaunting their wicked betrayal and intentionally ensuring that Arthur could hear every single breathless word and see every sickening movement. Derek even paused mid-act to point a mocking finger at the paralyzed old man, laughing cruelly as he told Evelyn that the useless cuckold probably enjoyed watching his beautiful wife finally be satisfied by a real man. A blinding, white-hot inferno of rage threatened to consume Arthur's sanity, but he drew upon the absolute, ironclad mental fortitude he had forged during his most grueling days in the Marine Corps, systematically building a massive psychological wall to block out the vile display. He focused all of his burning intensity on the tiny, almost imperceptible gleam of the camera lens hidden perfectly inside the ceiling smoke detector above the sofa, forcing himself to endure the ultimate humiliation because he knew Silas was capturing every single second of their depravity. Every insult they hurled, every drop of water they denied him, and every vile act they committed in his living room was being securely recorded in high definition, meticulously forging the absolute, undeniable weapon of their total annihilation. Arthur lay trapped in the mechanical hospital bed as the antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning, the deep, resonant sound marking the moment the townhouse finally fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Derek and Evelyn had long since retreated to the upstairs master bedroom, leaving behind the vile scent of stale scotch and artificial lavender air freshener hanging heavily in the freezing Boston night. Arthur used these precious, isolated hours to flex his stiff fingers and curl his toes beneath the heavy white sheets, meticulously circulating his blood and testing the returning strength in his muscles now that the toxic thallium was no longer being pumped into his system. It was a grueling, agonizing physical therapy conducted entirely in the absolute darkness, fueled solely by the burning promise of the catastrophic vengeance he was quietly, methodically orchestrating against the two traitors sleeping directly above him. His throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass from the agonizing dehydration Evelyn intentionally inflicted upon him, but he forced himself to endure the pain, knowing that breaking his cover prematurely would completely destroy the meticulous traps Silas had wired into the very walls around him. The profound silence of the living room was suddenly broken by the faint, almost imperceptible creak of the third wooden stair from the top, a specific, familiar sound Arthur recognized instantly from decades of listening to his family move through the historic home. A small, trembling shadow detached itself from the pitch-black darkness of the hallway, revealing his 9-year-old grandson clad in oversized superhero pajamas, his bare feet padding silently across the freezing hardwood floor. Mason crept into the ruined living room with the hesitation of a frightened ghost, his eyes wide and brimming with hot tears as he approached the terrifying array of medical apparatus that held the man he loved most in the entire world. The boy stopped at the very edge of the bed, his small shoulders shaking uncontrollably as he stared down at Arthur's bruised, motionless face, entirely convinced that his grandfather's brilliant mind and fierce spirit had been completely extinguished by the fiery coastal crash. He let out a soft, heartbroken whimper, whispering Arthur's name into the darkness as a single, heavy tear escaped his eyelashes and splashed warmly against the back of Arthur's stiff, bruised hand. Arthur kept his breathing perfectly shallow, his military-trained ears straining to detect any secondary footsteps or the rustle of expensive silk robes from the second-floor landing, ensuring beyond a shadow of a doubt that the two predators were still fast asleep. Satisfied that the immediate perimeter was entirely secure, Arthur slowly ceased his mechanical breathing rhythm, parting his dry lips slightly before opening his eyes to look directly into the terrified, grief-stricken face of his beloved grandson. Mason gasped, a sharp, ragged inhalation of pure shock, clapping both of his small hands tightly over his mouth to stifle the scream that instinctively rose in his throat as he stumbled backward a half-step in sheer disbelief. Before the boy's panic could fully metastasize and alert the monsters upstairs, Arthur offered a slow, deliberate wink, a perfectly calculated, deeply familiar gesture that completely shattered the terrifying illusion of the locked-in syndrome. The absolute terror in Mason's eyes melted instantly into a radiant, overwhelming joy, his small body practically vibrating with relief as he rushed forward to grip his grandfather's calloused hand with a desperate, life-affirming strength. Arthur lifted a trembling finger to his lips, urging absolute, unwavering silence, his voice nothing more than a raspy, sandpaper whisper as he assured the weeping boy that the grim medical diagnosis was nothing but an elaborate, necessary lie designed to trap the treacherous people upstairs. He explained with gentle but unwavering firmness that they were playing a highly dangerous, incredibly important game of survival, and he desperately needed his brave grandson to act as his secret soldier inside the hostile, occupied territory of their own home. Mason nodded furiously, scrubbing the wet tears from his flushed cheeks with the back of his pajama sleeve, his spine straightening visibly as he eagerly accepted the heavy burden of the clandestine mission, proving in that quiet moment that he possessed the exact same unbreakable iron will that had built the Pendleton Empire. When Arthur quietly confessed that he was starving and practically dying of thirst from Evelyn's calculated neglect, the boy immediately sprang into action, moving with the impressive stealth of a trained operative as he slipped into the dark kitchen to gather the vital supplies his grandfather desperately required. Mason returned mere moments later carrying a tall glass of icy tap water and a simple, hastily constructed peanut butter sandwich, presenting what Arthur considered to be the most magnificent feast he had ever laid eyes upon after days of consuming nothing but vile, gray nutrient paste. The boy carefully held the rim of the glass to Arthur's cracked lips, allowing the freezing water to wash away the lingering taste of chemical air freshener and old poison, revitalizing the older man's parched throat with a shocking, brilliant clarity that made him feel truly alive again. Arthur chewed the thick sandwich slowly in the comforting darkness, feeling the heavy rush of vital calories and essential energy flooding back into his depleted muscles, knowing that this simple act of childhood defiance was the exact medicine he needed to prepare his physical body for the impending war. They spent the next hour together in the quiet shadows, a fallen king and his youngest knight, communicating in hushed whispers as Mason dutifully reported everything he had seen and heard while navigating the treacherous environment created by his own mother and father. When the sky outside the heavy velvet curtains finally began to shift toward a pale, pre-dawn gray, Arthur kissed the boy's forehead and sent him back upstairs to bed, closing his eyes once more with a newly restored physical strength and a cold, terrifying certainty that the hour of his violent resurrection was rapidly approaching. The pale morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, casting long, somber shadows across the living room where Arthur lay trapped in his mechanical bed. True to the secret pact they had forged in the dead of night, Mason moved through the townhouse with the quiet, deliberate precision of a seasoned operative. Before grabbing his backpack for school, the 9-year-old boy slipped into the expansive chef's kitchen, sliding his personal iPad deep underneath the shadow of the marble island and setting it to transmit a live, continuous audio feed. Lying perfectly motionless under the sterile white hospital sheets, Arthur listened intently through a microscopic earpiece Silas's infiltration team had seamlessly embedded deep within his ear canal, the tiny device entirely invisible to the naked eye. The high-definition audio was crystal clear, capturing the sharp clinking of silverware and the heavy, exhausted sighs of the two traders as they sat down to consume an extravagant breakfast prepared from Arthur's own meticulously stocked pantry. The atmosphere in the kitchen was thick with a palpable, suffocating tension, the initial euphoria of their supposed victory having been completely eroded by the harsh, immediate reality of their frozen financial assets. Derek's voice was muffled by a mouthful of expensive imported bacon, his tone whining and aggressive as he complained bitterly about the massive legal retainers required to unfreeze the Pendleton estate. He paced the length of the kitchen, his heavy footsteps vibrating through the floorboards, cursing the high-powered Boston lawyers who were demanding exorbitant upfront fees just to navigate the complex web of Arthur's corporate trusts. The financial bleed was accelerating rapidly, and the terrifying shadow of Derek's underground loan sharks loomed closer with every passing hour, driving the desperate tech bro to ruthlessly evaluate every single expense in their household. Arthur listened with a cold, analytical detachment as Derek's frustration abruptly shifted targets, pivoting away from the legal hurdles and zeroing in on the 9-year-old boy who had just quietly exited the front door. Derek argued that Mason was an absolutely unnecessary financial drain, citing the immense cost of his private school tuition, his clothes, and his daily food, callously reducing the child's entire existence to a burdensome line item on a rapidly shrinking budget. The cruelty of Derek's assessment was staggering, but he quickly escalated his argument from financial complaints to a matter of absolute self-preservation, labeling the quiet, observant boy as a massive, unacceptable liability. He told Evelyn that Mason was becoming entirely too suspicious, constantly lurking in the hallways and staring at them with those same cold, judging eyes that Arthur used to possess, acting as a constant, silent witness to their ongoing depravity. Derek pointed out the catastrophic risk the boy posed if a state social worker or a mandated medical evaluator ever came to check on Arthur's condition, warning that a single misplaced sentence from the traumatized child could instantly unravel their entire, carefully constructed narrative and land them both in federal prison. He callously suggested that they needed to permanently remove the boy from the equation, floating the idea of shipping him off to a strict, cheap military academy in the middle of nowhere just to silence his unwanted observations and severely cut their operational costs. Arthur lay rigid in the adjacent room, his heart hammering a violent rhythm against his ribs as he desperately waited for Evelyn's maternal instinct to finally kick in, praying that she would draw a definitive line at discarding her own flesh and blood. The silence that followed stretched out over the audio feed, a cold, calculating pause that ultimately revealed the absolute, terrifying void where Evelyn's soul should have been. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely devoid of any protective emotion, lacking even a singular ounce of hesitation or maternal conflict as she casually agreed that Mason had to be removed from their lives immediately. Evelyn scoffed at the idea of paying for a military academy, suggesting an infinitely cheaper and more permanent solution by deciding to formally surrender her only child to the Massachusetts state foster care system the very next morning. She laid out her twisted, sickening strategy with the brilliant precision of a sociopath, planning to weep in front of the state authorities and falsely claim that the crushing, emotional burden of providing 24-hour medical care for her paralyzed husband had triggered a severe nervous breakdown. She intended to frame the horrific abandonment as a tragic, heartbreaking sacrifice made by a devoted wife who simply could no longer cope, manipulating the system to garner public sympathy while simultaneously erasing her son from her life to make room for more designer shoes and imported champagne. They actually laughed together over the dark brilliance of the plan, their cruel, mocking chuckles echoing through the earpiece and striking Arthur's mind like a sequence of physical blows. Arthur's vision went entirely red behind his closed eyelids, the simmering, calculated anger he had harbored for days instantly transmuting into an absolute, sub-zero rage that demanded immediate, catastrophic violence. He had endured the physical agony of the poison, the crushing humiliation of their insults, and the vile desecration of his home, but plotting to casually toss his beloved grandson into the unforgiving machinery of the state foster system was the final, unforgivable sin. He waited patiently until the audio feed captured the sound of the traders walking out to the back patio to smoke their morning cigarettes, their footsteps fading away as the heavy glass doors slid shut behind them. Moving with a terrifying, deliberate precision, Arthur slipped his hand beneath the heavy hospital mattress, his fingers wrapping around the cold, secure burner phone Silas had secretly planted during the initial infiltration. He did not hesitate, his thumb pressing firmly against the illuminated glass screen as he typed a single, definitive word to his underworld operative, sending the irreversible command that would permanently end the waiting game. He hit send on the word execute, sliding the phone back into the shadows and letting his breathing even out, knowing with absolute certainty that the water had finally risen high enough, and the dam was about to break. The heavy oak door of the Beacon Hill townhouse shuddered violently against its frame, the loud, rhythmic pounding shattering the late morning silence that had settled over the living room. Evelyn shouted from the hallway, her voice shrill and panicked as she desperately tried to keep the deadbolt engaged against the relentless force on the other side. But the person demanding entry possessed a fierce, uncompromising desperation, throwing their entire body weight against the thick wood until the reinforced lock finally gave way with a deafening, splintering crack. Sarah stormed into the grand foyer like a hurricane of righteous fury, her trench coat swirling around her trembling frame as she completely ignored Evelyn's frantic demands to leave the premises. She had driven straight from the bank after attempting to deposit the $50,000 check Arthur had given her, only to discover a labyrinth of frozen accounts and frantic whispers that led her right back to her childhood home. The moment Sarah crossed the threshold into the main living room, she stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching sharply in her throat as she surveyed the absolute devastation of her father's sanctuary. The sterile, peaceful medical environment Evelyn had meticulously described over the phone was a complete and utter lie, replaced instead by a disgusting landscape of squalor and profound neglect. Overturned furniture, shattered picture frames, and empty bottles of expensive vintage scotch littered the expensive hardwood floors, mixing with the sickening, artificial stench of cheap lavender spray used to mask the smell of decay. And there, positioned right in the center of the wreckage, was Arthur, his massive frame reduced to a motionless silhouette beneath stained, unwashed sheets, his lips cracked and dry from days of intentional dehydration. Sarah covered her mouth with trembling hands to stifle a horrified gasp, the devastating reality of her father's profound suffering hitting her with the force of a physical blow as she slowly approached the mechanical bed. Before Sarah could even reach out to touch Arthur's bruised hand, a dark, swaying shadow detached itself from the kitchen archway, revealing Derek in all of his arrogant, hungover glory. He was carelessly draped in Arthur's expensive silk robe, a half-empty glass of amber liquor dangling loosely from his fingers, looking every bit the corrupt king presiding over a ruined, stolen castle. He slurred a sarcastic greeting to his weeping wife, his eyes darting immediately to the leather purse clutched tightly against her chest as he greedily demanded she hand over the $50,000 check she had procured from the old man. Sarah turned slowly to face her husband, the deep well of fear and submission she had harbored for years suddenly evaporating, replaced entirely by a cold, hardening realization of his absolute treachery. She looked around the trashed room and then back at Derek, her voice dropping to a quiet, steady whisper as she finally connected the dots of his massive, unforgivable deception, realizing his tech company was never in danger and his investors were nothing more than a fiction designed to bleed her father dry. Derek's sloppy, confident smirk vanished the instant he recognized the profound shift in his wife's demeanor, his posture stiffening as the raw, unvarnished truth hung heavily in the freezing air between them. Sarah stood her ground, her voice rising in volume and intensity as she boldly accused him of orchestrating a massive fraud, declaring that Arthur had warned her about their greed, but she had been entirely too blind and manipulated to see the monsters living right in front of her. She flatly refused to hand over a single dime, clutching her purse tighter and promising to drag every single piece of this squalid nightmare into the harsh light of a courtroom if it was the last thing she ever did. Lying perfectly still beneath his sheets, Arthur felt a surge of profound pride for his daughter, watching her finally shatter the chains of Derek's psychological abuse. But that absolute defiance triggered a sudden, explosive rage within Derek, the cornered predator instantly abandoning all pretenses of marital affection as he aggressively closed the distance between them, completely disregarding Evelyn's weak warnings from the hallway as he lunged forward to corner Sarah against the heavy marble fireplace. He spewed a torrent of vile insults, calling her a weak, pathetic pawn who was only ever useful for the vast inheritance she was supposed to effortlessly provide, demanding she surrender the assets before he lost his temper completely. When Sarah stubbornly refused and attempted to push past him toward the front door, Derek raised his hand and delivered a brutal, resounding slap across her cheek, the sickening crack echoing loudly through the silent house. The sheer force of the blow sent Sarah crashing heavily to the hardwood floor, her purse skidding away into the debris as she gasped in pain, clutching her rapidly bruising face in absolute shock. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream of pure, unadulterated fury shattered the tension, drawing every eye in the room toward the grand mahogany staircase. Mason, having heard the escalating violence from his bedroom, came charging down the steps like a miniature warrior, wielding a heavy plastic toy baseball bat in his small hands. The 9-year-old boy threw himself fearlessly between his fallen aunt and his towering, abusive father, swinging the plastic weapon with all of his might as he screamed at Derek to leave his family alone, unknowingly setting the stage for the sleeping giant in the hospital bed to finally rise. Derek snatched the plastic toy bat from Mason's small hands with a vicious snarl, snapping the cheap material in half before grabbing the 9-year-old boy by the collar of his pajama shirt. He lifted the child entirely off the hardwood floor, his face twisted into an ugly mask of unhinged fury as he drew his clenched fist back, fully intending to strike the boy who had dared to interrupt his violent extortion. Sarah screamed from her position on the floor, scrambling desperately to reach her nephew, while Evelyn simply watched from the hallway with an expression of cold, detached boredom. Lying beneath the stained hospital sheets, Arthur felt the final, fragile thread of his calculated patience snap completely, the meticulously planned long game instantly incinerated by the blinding, white-hot reality of his grandson being physically threatened. The dam broke, and the dormant architect of the Pendleton Empire finally decided it was time to tear the entire corrupt structure down to its very foundation. Moving with a terrifying, explosive suddenness that defied his supposed medical condition, Arthur ripped the heavy medical tape from his arm, tearing the intravenous needle out of his vein in a spray of worn crimson that starkly stained the pristine white linens. He reached down and swiftly unbuckled the heavy nylon restraints he had secretly loosened during the dark, silent hours of the night, throwing the suffocating blankets aside as he swung his muscular legs over the edge of the mechanical bed. He stood up, his bare feet planting firmly on the ruined hardwood floor as he drew himself up to his full 6'2" stature, completely ignoring the lingering dizziness from the poison as pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded his system. He did not look like a frail, dying old man miraculously cured by a medical intervention, but rather a resurrected titan, a formidable force of nature crawling back from the edge of the grave specifically to drag his enemies down into the dirt. Derek's raised fist froze instantly in mid-air, the arrogant, abusive sneer practically melting off his face as his eyes bulged in sheer, unadulterated terror. He dropped Mason, allowing the boy to land safely on his feet and quickly scramble over to the protective embrace of his weeping aunt, while Derek stumbled backward until his spine collided sharply with the edge of the marble fireplace. He stared at Arthur with his mouth hanging open, violently shaking his head in absolute denial as he stuttered that the old man was supposed to be completely paralyzed, his alcohol-soaked brain entirely unable to comprehend the towering reality standing before him. Evelyn let out a short, breathless shriek of pure horror from the foyer, her hands flying to her mouth as the devastating realization crashed over her, fully understanding that every vile insult and wicked confession she had uttered in this room had been heard by a fully conscious, deeply vengeful husband. Arthur did not shout or scream, simply staring them down with the cold, dead eyes of a combat veteran clearing a hostile room, his deep, rumbling voice vibrating through the silent house as he informed Derek that there were absolutely no miracles in this room, only severe consequences. Arthur stepped methodically through the devastating debris of his ruined living room, his bare feet crunching heavily over the shattered glass of the framed family photographs they had recklessly destroyed. He reached the ornate marble hearth and wrapped his large, calloused hand around the thick, solid brass fire poker that Derek had casually been using to smash his custom oak bookshelves. Driven by the frantic, mindless instinct of a cornered rat who suddenly realizes the trap has snapped shut, Derek reached into the pocket of the stolen silk robe and produced a silver switchblade, flicking the sharp metal blade open with a loud click. He waved the weapon wildly in the dim light, his voice cracking with hysterical panic as he threatened to get the older man, desperately trying to project the lethal confidence he absolutely did not possess. Arthur let out a dry, harsh laugh entirely devoid of humor, mocking the foolish younger man for bringing a pocket knife to a genuine war before bracing his stance for the inevitable strike. Derek lunged forward in a desperate, incredibly sloppy attack, aiming the sharp blade directly for Arthur's stomach in a frantic bid to end the confrontation quickly. Drawing upon decades of deeply ingrained military muscle memory, Arthur effortlessly pivoted his torso, allowing the silver blade to slice harmlessly through the empty air mere inches from his ribs. Utilizing Derek's own reckless momentum against him, Arthur shifted his weight and brought the solid brass fire poker crashing down upon the younger man's extended right forearm with a brutal, uncompromising force. The sickening, hollow crunch of shattering bone echoed like a gunshot through the silent townhouse, instantly followed by Derek's high-pitched wail of absolute, blinding agony as the switchblade clattered uselessly across the floorboards. Derek collapsed heavily to his knees, clutching his mangled arm tightly against his chest and sobbing uncontrollably, begging Arthur for a mercy he had never once shown to the paralyzed man he had tormented for days. Seeing her powerful co-conspirator instantly reduced to a weeping, broken mess on the floor, Evelyn scrambled frantically toward the heavy oak front door in a desperate, cowardly bid to escape into the city. But just as her trembling fingers reached for the brass handle, the heavy door swung firmly shut, and Silas stepped gracefully out from the shadows of the exterior porch, sliding the heavy deadbolt securely into place. The ruthless private investigator crossed his arms over his chest, wearing a cold, terrifying smirk as he calmly informed the panicked woman that the performance was just getting to the good part, effectively sealing the two predators inside the very cage they had so gleefully constructed. Arthur advanced on the weeping pair, the heavy brass poker still resting firmly in his grip, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy growl as he commanded them to strip off every single piece of clothing and jewelry that had been purchased with his stolen money. When Derek hesitated, openly whimpering as he cradled his shattered arm, Arthur raised the heavy brass weapon slightly higher, promising to break the other arm if he did not comply immediately. Sobbing pathetic apologies, Derek clumsily stripped away the expensive silk robe and kicked off his imported leather shoes, while Evelyn wept hysterically as she unzipped her designer dress and unclasped the heavy diamond earrings from her lobes. She threw the sparkling remnants of her stolen luxury onto the hardwood floor, leaving them both standing in the center of the living room in nothing but their thin undergarments, completely stripped of their false dignity and unearned wealth. Silas silently pulled the front door wide open, allowing the bitter, freezing winds of the harsh Boston winter to sweep violently through the grand foyer, biting instantly into their exposed skin. Arthur pointed the brass poker toward the dark, icy street, ordering them out of his house and out of his life forever, watching with a profound, quiet satisfaction as the two shivering, humiliated traitors stumbled backward out into the unforgiving snow, finally purging the deep, toxic rot from his beautiful home. The brilliant crystal chandeliers of the Sterling Hotel's grand ballroom cast a warm, golden glow over the annual Pendleton Charity Gala, an event that gathered the absolute pinnacle of Boston's high society to raise millions of dollars for local children's hospitals. Exactly 1 week had passed since the brutal, freezing night Arthur had purged the toxic rot from his Beacon Hill townhouse, and he stood on the sweeping mezzanine balcony looking every inch the resurrected titan in a perfectly tailored bespoke tuxedo. Sarah stood proudly by his side, wearing a stunning midnight blue gown, her posture straight and her eyes clear, having entirely shed the suffocating weight of her husband's psychological abuse to finally embrace her rightful place within the family dynasty. Down in the secure VIP suite, Mason was happily watching movies with a trusted nanny, safely insulated from the final, devastating act of the theatrical war his grandfather was about to conclude. Arthur sipped a glass of sparkling water, exchanging polite nods with the city's mayor and the police commissioner, knowing full well that desperation bred a specific kind of reckless stupidity, and that the starving rats he had cast out into the cold were bound to make one last, desperate grab for the cheese. The low, elegant hum of the string quartet was violently interrupted when the massive oak doors of the ballroom were suddenly thrown open, causing a heavy, confused silence to ripple instantly through the crowd of 500 wealthy donors. Evelyn and Derek marched into the dazzling light of the gala, looking absolutely nothing like the arrogant, designer-clad socialites who had once paraded through Boston's most exclusive boutiques. Evelyn's hair was a tangled, unkempt mess pulled into a frantic bun, and she wore a stained, wrinkled dress that had clearly been procured from a discount thrift store, her face gaunt and her makeup applied with a violently shaking hand. Derek looked even more pathetic, wearing an oversized, faded suit that hung loosely off his diminishing frame, his shattered right arm encased in a filthy gray fiberglass cast that served as a permanent reminder of his failed switchblade attack. They moved with the frantic, unhinged energy of cornered animals, pushing aggressively through the sea of horrified guests and flashing press cameras to reach the elevated main stage where the charity auctioneer's microphone stood waiting. Before the hotel security team could intercept them, Derek snatched the microphone from its stand, the speakers screeching with a harsh burst of feedback that made the entire ballroom wince in unison. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly up at the mezzanine balcony where Arthur stood, his voice cracking with hysterical desperation as he shouted to the elite crowd that Arthur Pendleton was a total fraud and a violent, abusive monster. He wildly claimed that the billionaire had lost his mind, brutally assaulting his own family and tossing them penniless into the freezing streets, painting a vivid, entirely fabricated picture of domestic terror designed to manipulate the influential audience. Evelyn immediately seized her cue, grabbing the microphone from Derek to unleash a torrent of manufactured tears, weeping theatrically as she begged the wealthy patrons and the eagerly recording journalists for help, claiming she was a battered, grieving wife whose entire life had been stolen by a senile tyrant. They were banking entirely on Arthur's well-known preference for extreme privacy, deeply convinced that the proud magnate would quietly pay them millions of dollars in hush money just to avoid a catastrophic public scandal that could severely damage the Pendleton corporate reputation. Arthur gripped the polished mahogany railing of the balcony, looking down at the two pathetic figures shivering on the stage, completely devoid of any lingering anger or sorrow, feeling only the cold, clinical satisfaction of an architect watching a perfectly constructed demolition. He did not shout defensively or scramble down the grand staircase to argue with their desperate lies, but instead offered a small, terrifyingly calm smile before raising his right hand to deliver a single, subtle nod toward the darkened audiovisual control booth suspended high above the floor. Silas stood behind the massive soundboard, returning the nod before plunging the entire grand ballroom into absolute darkness, instantly cutting off the microphone power and silencing Evelyn's theatrical wailing mid-sob. The sudden, suffocating blackness lasted for only 3 agonizing seconds before the massive, 500-inch high-definition projection screen spanning the entire back wall of the stage suddenly flickered to brilliant, blinding life, illuminating the horrified faces of the Boston elite. The first piece of undeniable evidence filled the massive screen, displaying the grainy, starkly lit hidden camera footage of the Beacon Hill living room, clearly showing Arthur lying paralyzed and helpless in his medical bed while the two traitors engaged in their vile acts. The concert-grade speakers amplified Derek's cruel, mocking voice bouncing off the high ceilings as he pointed at the incapacitated old man and gleefully insulted him, instantly drawing a collective, visceral gasp of absolute disgust from the 500 prominent guests. Before Derek could even attempt to stammer out a pathetic excuse about fabricated footage, the screen shifted to a stark black background displaying a single, pulsating audio waveform, broadcasting the crystal-clear recording Mason had captured from the bathroom. Evelyn's cold, unfeeling voice echoed throughout the grand hall, stating explicitly that the medicine had soaked in enough and that the old man's heart would finally stop, instantly transforming a domestic dispute into a highly public, indisputable confession of attempted first-degree murder. Evelyn dropped to her knees on the stage, covering her ears and screaming in absolute terror as the horrific reality of her public execution finally set in, but the merciless audiovisual assault was not yet complete. The screen flashed one final time to display the official, red-stamped toxicology report from Massachusetts General Hospital alongside the final, devastating kitchen recording where the two conspirators casually plotted to throw 9-year-old Mason into the state foster care system. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic for the traitors, a tidal wave of profound revulsion and furious outrage that completely swallowed the two trembling figures cowering under the blinding glare of the projection screen. Wealthy mothers clutched their pearls in horror, influential fathers clenched their fists in silent fury, and the flashing cameras of the local press corps captured every single second of the spectacular downfall, ensuring that the names Derek and Evelyn would forever be synonymous with the absolute darkest depths of human depravity. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom burst open once more, this time admitting a highly coordinated squad of uniformed Boston police officers led by a stern, gray-haired detective who marched purposefully through the parted crowd of horrified socialites. Derek tried to scramble backward across the elevated stage, his broken arm throbbing violently within its filthy cast, but he was quickly intercepted and pinned firmly against the polished floorboards by two massive officers. The seasoned detective stood over the trembling, weeping man and loudly listed the devastating array of formal charges, his booming voice echoing across the silent hall as he cited attempted first-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, massive wire fraud, and aggravated child endangerment. Derek sobbed uncontrollably, begging pathetically for a high-priced lawyer and pleading for a mercy he had never once extended to his paralyzed father-in-law, his arrogant tech bro facade completely and permanently shattered as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his one good wrist. The officers hauled him roughly to his feet, reading him his rights as they dragged him through the sea of flashing press cameras, ensuring his humiliating downfall was permanently documented for the morning papers. Realizing that the overwhelming police presence was focused entirely on securing her husband, Evelyn attempted to quietly slip away through the chaotic, whispering crowd, pushing her way frantically toward the discreet service exit at the rear of the hotel. She burst through the heavy metal doors into the freezing, dimly lit alleyway, her breath misting violently in the bitter winter air as she prepared to sprint toward the bustling city streets to disappear into the night. But her desperate escape was abruptly halted when three massive, leather-clad men stepped smoothly out from the pitch-black shadows of the commercial dumpsters, their menacing, predatory presence confirming instantly that they were the ruthless underground bookies Derek had failed to pay. Evelyn backed up slowly until her spine hit the freezing, wet brick wall of the alley, pleading frantically that the massive financial debts belonged solely to her incarcerated husband, but the lead enforcer merely offered a cold, humorless smile. He reached into his heavy jacket and produced the original loan paperwork, holding it up to the flickering security light to clearly display her own forged signature, coldly informing her that husband's lie and that she was now the sole collateral for a $100,000 debt. Frantic and completely out of options, Evelyn turned back toward the slightly open service door, locking eyes with Arthur, who stood silently in the warm, golden threshold of the hotel hallway. She screamed his name, her voice echoing off the brick walls as she begged for salvation, promising to apologize and claiming that Derek had forced her into the murderous plot against her will. Arthur simply stood there, looking at the treacherous woman who had cheerfully poisoned his nightly tea and callously planned to toss his beloved 9-year-old grandson into the unforgiving machinery of the state foster system. He felt absolutely no pity, no lingering affection, and no remorse as he reached out and pulled the heavy steel door firmly shut, sliding the industrial deadbolt into place and leaving her entirely to the absolute, unforgiving mercy of the Boston underworld. The heavy door permanently severed her from the luxurious world she had tried to steal, ensuring that her designer dresses and her arrogant entitlement would be systematically stripped away by the harsh, violent reality of working off a debt to men who possessed no souls. 6 months later, the sweet, earthy smell of hickory smoke and blooming pine trees drifted peacefully across the expansive wooden deck of the Pendleton family lake house nestled deep in the tranquil mountains of upstate New York. Arthur stood at the outdoor grill, turning thick steaks with a pair of long silver tongs, breathing in the crisp, clean air with lungs that were finally and completely free of any lingering heavy metal toxins. Down on the manicured green lawn, Mason was throwing a football, his joyous, uninhibited laughter echoing beautifully across the rippling water, the young boy completely healed from the terrifying shadows of his former life in Beacon Hill. Sarah sat at the glass patio table chopping fresh vegetables, her posture perfectly straight and her eyes radiating a fierce, confident light, having entirely shed the hollowed-out ghost she had been under Derek's oppressive, manipulative thumb. They ate their dinner together as the sun began to set, the circle incredibly small but forged from an unbreakable alloy of absolute trust and shared survival, enjoying a profound peace that had been purchased with a very heavy price. When the dinner plates were finally cleared away, Arthur retreated briefly to his study and returned with a heavy leather briefcase, setting it gently onto the glass table as the twilight painted the sky in brilliant shades of violet and gold. He slid a thick blue bankbook across the table toward Mason, revealing a meticulously structured trust fund holding exactly $5 million, telling the weeping boy that his bravery had saved their lives and that his future dreams were now forever secure. Arthur then handed a massive stack of bound legal contracts to Sarah, officially naming her the new chief executive officer of Pendleton Builders and transferring the absolute ownership of the entire corporate empire into her highly capable hands. He explained with a warm, genuine smile that he was finally ready to truly retire, wanting nothing more than to fix up classic cars in his garage and watch his grandson grow into a man of honor, completely trusting his fierce daughter to lead their legacy into the next century. Sarah stood up and wrapped her arms tightly around her father's neck, crying tears of profound relief and promising that she would never let him down, her spirit finally completely free to soar. As the stars began to pinpoint the darkening sky, Arthur leaned back in his chair and looked at his true family, deeply reflecting on the harrowing journey that had brought them to this quiet, sacred sanctuary. He realized that the sharpest knives often come from the hands of those who hold you the closest, and that a fortress of money could never keep the wolves at bay if you willingly invited them in for dinner. True wealth was not measured in massive bank accounts, luxury vehicles, or towering skyscrapers, but in the unwavering loyalty of the people who fearlessly stood beside you when the house was actively burning to the ground. Evelyn and Derek had fatally mistaken his quiet patience for senile weakness, entirely failing to understand that the master architect who built the foundation could effortlessly tear it down and leave them buried forever in the rubble. If you believe that quiet dignity and calculated truth will always triumph over loud, arrogant cruelty, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice, resilience, and the unbreakable power of family.